Welcome to the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science Research Podcast Series at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, the first Sino-Foreign university. I'm Dr. Mary Jane Ainsley, Associate Professor in International Communications.
And I'm Dr. Derek Irwin, Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics. We're coming to you from the Language and Pedagogy Laboratory here at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences.
For this edition of the series, we're going to be discussing a publication by Dr. Shravan Luckraz. Shravan is a professor in the School of Economics. He is on the editorial board of the Bulletin of the Institute of Mathematics and on the board of reviewers of Mathematical Reviews of the American Mathematical Society. At UNNC, he teaches PhD-level advanced microeconomic theory.
It's a lot of math. Shravan is a long-serving member of the International Society of Dynamic Games and was awarded the Natural Science Foundation of China grant and fellowship in 2016 and 2019. Most recently, he was awarded the Westlake Friendship Award by Zhejiang Province government, the highest honor Zhejiang Province can bestow upon a foreign national.
Whoa, that's pretty impressive.
It is impressive.
In 2022, Shravan published the paper on a contraction-like property of dismantlable graphs in the Journal of Computational and Applied Mathematics, which is not a journal that's on my bedtime reading list. How about you, Derek?
It absolutely is. It helps me sleep very soundly.
Wonderful.
I'm kidding. I'm sorry, Shravan.
You spoke too soon.
I did find this fascinating, mostly because it made me feel enormously stupid. And I'd like to say I'm not used to that, but I guess in some ways I am. But I'm not used to it in reading kind of professional papers. It's well outside of our area, and I'm sure the technicalities of it are quite difficult in some ways to grasp. But in a broad sense, I don't think the paper is that difficult in what it's grappling with. Mm-hmm. Although I think we'll leave that to Shravan to explain in a bit more detail.
Sure. I mean, I had to basically go and ask for wider guidance on this, which is the first time in this series that I've had to do that. And when actually some of the basics were explained to me as a non-mathematics and non-economics person, they weren't hugely difficult to get my head round, I thought. But maybe we could actually ask the expert, who, by coincidence, is here in the studio with us right now. Welcome, Shravan.
Thank you very much for having me, Mary and Derek, and thank you for your kind introduction.
Not a problem. Could you please give an overview maybe of your paper, the topic and maybe the main argument?
Yeah, so this paper is about a contraction-like property of dismantlable graphs. It has three main aspects. The first aspect is game theory. The second aspect is graph theory. And the third aspect is fixed point. So this is about solution concepts in game theory. So there are roughly three different subfields of mathematics. And the paper brings the three subfields together. So in the paper, I discovered a new interesting property of a very well-known class of graphs. And I use that property to solve some problems in a type of games that is called pursuit-evasion games on graphs.
So do you mind if I just jump in for a sec, Shravan? Because our listeners might not really understand the mathematical concept of graphs. I know when I approach this, I'm a linguist, so I work with various kinds of graphs, but they're not particularly the kind that we're talking about here, at least in a simplified form, right? So maybe you can explain the base concept of what a graph means in this context in terms of kind of nodes and edges and these type of ideas.
Yeah. So you can think of a graph as a network. I mean, one other importance of this result is that we don't put so much structure on the graph. You can think of it as any general graph. So anything that you can conceive as a graph can be actually represented by this type of property. So think of a chessboard, for example, an 8x8 chessboard. I mean, that would be an example of a graph. Think of a complicated network. I mean, if you're familiar with computer science, you may think of graph theory as being used to model networks. Think of social media, for example. I mean, you've got friends and friends of friends and so on. And then you can think of how are we all connected. And this is also an example of a graph. There are so many structures that you can think of, things that you see in daily life. Think of research collaboration distance, I think, for researchers. So think of, you may have collaborators somewhere here within our faculty. You can have collaborators within the university, and you can also have collaborators within the Nottingham umbrella, which could be in Malaysia or in the UK. And you could also have collaborators outside Nottingham. And we could actually form a network among all of your collaborators.
Okay,
and that
so
would be represented
that,
by a graph.
Yeah, that's great. That clarifies a lot. Here, we're using this kind of graphing approach to talk about, you call them pursuit-evasion games, and you could potentially do this on a chessboard, right? So if you just had the two kings, you could say this is a pursuit-evasion game where you try to move one and then you move the other, and the object is for one to catch the other and the other to evade the first, right?
Yeah, so I was thinking of a nice simple example, and I think Derek almost read my mind, and I think the chessboard with two kings would be a very good example, except that we can't really label one as a pursuer and the other as an evader, because both are trying to capture each other, both are trying to evade from each other in that particular instance. But if we modify the rule of a game, we could actually have a pursuit evasion game well defined on a chessboard with just two players.
And the example you use is the cop and robber game, right? So that this,
yeah,
maybe you can explain that.
Yeah, I enjoyed learning about this, actually, the cops and robbers framework. So do please tell us more about this.
Yeah, actually, there's a book on this by Nowakowski and Bonato, and that was published by the American Mathematical Society, I think, about more than 10 years ago. It gives you a nice overview of this topic. But I think the label cops and robber really is to describe a more general class of game that is called pursuit evasion. And I think if you give me time, I could probably elaborate a little bit more on pursuit evasion and its history, because I think it is a good time. 2023 is a good year because it's almost 100 years since Rado, a very famous mathematician, proposed the first pursuit evasion game, which was a game played between a lion and a man. Was called actually the lion and the man problem. So Rado himself, I think it was in the 1930s, proposed a solution to this problem. But he was proved wrong about 30 years later by another mathematician called Besikovic. In fact, Rado thought that the man could always escape by running through boundary of that space. It was just a disk, actually. Besikovic proved that the lion could actually capture the man in a finite number of steps. So this, the field itself was developed around that time because there were mathematicians working for the Rand Corporation. The Rand Corporation was interested in game theory, and I think the reason was mainly warfare at that time. So there were many mathematicians working on games, including John Nash, including Richard Bellman, Rufus Isaacs. And that field was developed around that time. It looks like a very, very naive problem. You think about it, a lion and a man and a lion chasing a man, what its significance, but its significance is fairly powerful in mathematics because it led to several tools in what we call dynamic optimization and optimal control theory that are used by many mathematical I think people who applied mathematics in economics, in biology, in computer science, in engineering, and even by pure mathematicians. So an interesting application is even in biology. I think people have been trying to model cancer, how a cancer spread in a body using this kind of pursuit evasion games. It has been used in robotics. It has been used in network security, in computer science. It is also used in economics. I have colleagues who actually use some of these results, some of these techniques to solve their own problem in macroeconomics. So it is very significant. So that the lion and the man problem has led to several breakthroughs in the field of optimization. And at the same time, there were people in economics who were interested in optimization over time. So, for example, people who study growth theory in economics, they want to actually think of long-term path of variables like consumption, inflation, and so on. But all of these could be models by a game where you make decision over time. So you actually have to take a decision at each point in time, and you need to think of the path of that decision variable. So all these applications have been made, I suppose, by several scholars. And I think this class of games is widely studied. And there are so many open problems, both in mathematics and also in computer science, that are unsolved as of today.
Can I ask you about a very pertinent area in epidemiology? So these, I assume, would apply as well for the kind of spread of disease and things like that.
Yeah. I would think, I mean, at the time during the COVID-19, during the pandemic, I was thinking whether we could actually use some of these to actually think of how you can actually stop the spread of a disease or rather contain it. I don't know if there are people who've done it at that time, but there are studies, at least that uses this kind of technique to think of how you stop a fire from propagating in a forest, for instance, and things like that. So such techniques are available. I'm just not sure if it's been used.
I was thinking more about sort of industry regulation in this way and how this sort of mathematical framework could help us in sort of this environment. So things like kind of Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, blockchain, etc., sort of how to regulate these through this sort of cops and robbers framework. Because I know that these regulators have kind of been trying to catch up with this in essence and want to sort of regulate bad actors, but not make things bad for good actors as well.
Yeah, no, I suppose you could do that. I mean, especially the whole blockchain. I mean, computer scientists are very interested in the structure of the network and how do you make it work and what do you allow, what you don't allow. And yeah, I suppose it can be used, but I've not seen it done so far.
Oh.
Well, we may have a money maker on your hands there, Mary.
But bear in mind that there is a wide spectrum of subdisciplines between the theory and actually the applied world. So there is a lot to be done before actually get to the application.
I was fascinated by this actually, Shravan, because this is very theoretical, right?
I'm a theorist, so I think most of my work are theoretical, and it takes a while for applied people to pick it up and then to start using it.
Yeah, I was struck by the note at the end here that no data was used for the research described in the article. And I just thought to myself, what an aspiration.
Yeah, I mean, it's typically true for theorists. I mean, we build mathematical model, we solve problems, and we don't use data. So it's not really an empirical study in that sense.
That was one sort of, well, that follows on to my sort of next question in that I did find that when I was asking around sort of for assistance in understanding some parts of this paper, I obviously asked economists because you're from the School of Economics in that way. And I realized that graph theory is actually not so much part of the standard toolkit of economic theory. It seemed actually quite unusual and quite non-standard in that way. So can you explain the role that graph theory plays in your research? And do you think maybe that it should be deployed more in economics more generally?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a fairly good question. I would say that you're absolutely right to say that graph theory is not part of the toolbox of economists, especially the game theory part of economics. However, recently, I think in the past 20 years, it's been used to model networks, and we call that really network games. So some people have been using that. We've got PhD students here actually working on networks. In fact, they do experiments on a network, how people are connected, and how do we provide a public good when we have a network structure. But in terms of the solution concepts I provide in my research, they are not very standard in economics. But I hope that in the future, economists take it on. I mean, take on this kind of approach to model.
Your background does seem a little bit unusual in that you do seem to come from a very mathematical sort of origins in your specialism, in your research. How did you end up in the School of Economics? And is this an unusual place for somebody with your background to actually gravitate to you, or is that quite normal?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. I mean, yes, because my origin is philosophy, mathematics, and partly economics. So I think my bachelor's degree was mostly in mathematics and philosophy of logic. I got interested in economics mainly through game theory, which is my area of research. Game theory itself is a field of mathematics, but widely used in economics. You can think that in the past, I would say, 20 years or more than 20 years, there have been at least 5 Nobel Prizes in economics awarded to game theories. And I would say 3 out of 5 of those Nobel Prize winners are mathematician background in pure mathematics that end up doing game theory after and then finding nice application in economics. So yes, unusual for someone with a pure mathematics background to actually end up doing economics, ending up in the School of Economics, but there have been cases, and some of these cases have been fairly successful in producing a result.
Well, from reading your bio, it sounds like you are one of those fairly successful cases.
I wouldn't say so. I mean, it's very flattering, unfortunately, but I wish I could be one of those cases. But I'm talking about Nobel Prize winners and pioneers in fields or subfields of economics who have this kind of background. I think I can name quite a few, actually, mathematicians who made it big in economics.
Well, you got the Westlake Award, so a Nobel Prize is just around the corner. I think next, isn't it, Shravan?
well, again, round the corner, it's a long way to get round the corner. But I think, part of my research really is to work on an open problem, which is a conjecture due to a French mathematician. His name was Henri Béniel. And his conjecture is unsolved as at now. It's on the games of cops and robber, and it's related to the paper that we are talking about. And I hope that my paper can, in the future, subsequent research using some of the results in my paper can lead to breaking that conjecture, and that could be something that could lead to an interesting reward, I think, in the mathematics community, if we can make that.
So maybe let's get back to the paper, just to explain a little further about it, because I'm not going to pretend I understood the whole thing.
You're doing a good job so far.
I am an actor. I was trained to fake it. So I'm doing my best, but I hope there's not a quiz at the end of this. What it seems like you've done, what you claim to have done, at least in your abstract for sure, is to build on the work by Baradal, Gopal, and Radnovic, right? So they had certain findings in terms of what are being called contraction properties here, right? So the idea of, well, first of all, maybe take a couple of steps back. With the cop and robber game, there are kind of the cop win type of games, and then there's the robber win type of game, and then what you're proposing is more open version, right? Did I get that correct?
Yeah, so let me try to answer your question, and I'll elaborate a little bit. First of all, yeah, I think an actor is better than a theorist. I'm a theorist, so at least you act, but we just imagine things most of the time. So I think an actor is far better than a theorist. In terms of the work by Baradal, Gopal, and Radenovic, so remember that the paper, I describe the paper as touching on three important aspects, and there's the game aspect, the graph aspect, and the fixed point, or what we can call the contraction aspect. So contraction is just like a convergence property of a solution. So the paper by Baradal, Gopal, and Radenovic is more on that contraction aspect, on the fixed point part of the solution. My paper is about the game, showing that you can actually use that kind of approach to solve a game on a graph.
So maybe you can explain then dismantlable graphs and contrast that with alternatives.
Yeah, I think a dismantlable graph, again, it was invented by Richard Nowakowski. I think he had an interview, actually, about 5 years ago. And in that interview, he said that one of the most important contributions of his career was to develop this dismantlable graph, because it has proved to be really useful in solving this kind of game. So what is a dismantlable graph, really? So if you think of a graph as we've described earlier on, as a network or a set of nodes connected by the edges, it's a graph that you can actually break it down to a single point, to a single vertex, through a sequence of operations. So you could actually use a sequence of mathematical operation to actually reduce it to just one vertex. Not all the graphs have this property. Like the one you're thinking of, a chessboard, does not have this property.
There's multiple vertices. Right?
Yeah, so it wouldn't have this property. So an example of a graph that has that property, you could think of a star graph, a graph that just have one central node, and then all its neighbors are connected to it through the edges. So this graph would be dismantlable. So if you think of a tree, I don't know if you've ever seen like a decision tree, if you've read a little bit about graphs using computer science. So decision trees can be actually dismantled into one single node. So this is the property of this graph here. And if this property is satisfied, then if you play that game on that graph, then the cop would win the game all the time, no matter where you start. And that's what we prove.
So just to kind of pull in another term here. So the cop win is finite cop win, presumably, because whenever the cop wins, it means that there's an end to
Absolutely.
The sequence.
Absolutely.
One thing I was curious about, and these are just practical questions. Like if you're going to set up a kind of graph to be able to go place to place playing this kind of game, your equations take into account varying sizes and things like this. But do people actually ever sit down and play this? Is this something that people go through?
So I mean, the example you started with earlier on the chessboard, I mean, very often if you're playing a game of chess, you do find yourself in situations like that where you could actually apply some of this logic. So when you apply a theory, you probably try to just use the gist of the solution and you try to apply it in the relevant context. So I wouldn't say people actually sit down and play this game, but it is rather the tool we develop in solving this game that could actually be useful for other purpose, not for the purpose of the game itself. The game looks fairly naive if you think of a lion and the man problem, games of cops and robber. We even have a version of a princess and a monster. We have a lady of the lake problem, and all these look like completely useless for the real world. But the solution we use, the solution we develop, lead to a very powerful toolbox that can be used in many applications.
I'm interested in these applications and the potential application of your work. For instance, I mean, could a graph be used to measure something like financial risk, for example? So financial instability in banking, for instance. Could it help us better understand things like the fragility of systems like this?
Yeah, I mean, there was some economists, some macroeconomists who studied something known as contagion during the financial crisis. So I think if a sector is I mean, how do you actually stop a bankrupt sector to actually corrupt the whole system, the whole economy? And such technique could be particularly relevant to solve this kind of problem. So if you think of financial crisis, how it started, could we actually stop it? Could we have actually stopped it if we could contain it? I mean, you could. So some of the techniques we develop can be used to stop the propagation of something.
Oh, I was just thinking of early video games. Did you ever see the movie War Games? And I think it was a Matthew Broderick film, but it was the idea of early AI being exposed to tic-tac-toe. And it had to learn that there was no winning in tic-tac-toe. All that mattered is the first player, basically.
Sure.
Is that the type of application that might be relevant here?
Yeah, I think people in AI have also used some of these techniques, but I think a more useful application would be to stop the propagation of worms on a network, like viruses, for example. And I've been working with computer scientists. This is just a new project, and I'm myself learning how we could use some of this technique to stop worms, for example, from infiltrating networks.
And so how does that kind of work, Shravan? Or is it because you're able to drop edges between nodes?
No, I mean, like, it works because of this dismantlable property, and I'll try to explain that. So what does the dismantlable property say? Well, it says in the game theory part, it says that one cop is enough to capture the robber. That's the structure of the graph. But what if that condition is not satisfied? Then you actually increase the number of cops. Then we have another question that we call the cop number. So do you think 2 cops would be able to capture the robber, or 3 cops? Then we can talk about some idea of efficiency. What's the least number of cops that you need to actually capture the robber? And this is where all the application, this is where we can get all this application, because we can think of how do you protect a network and what's the most efficient way in which you can protect the network.
One of the interesting things, of course, is the cop win situation has the cop going first, right?
Yeah.
Whereas presumably in the kind of situation you're describing, your negative actor has the first move. Yeah. And so then you have to model how to catch up to that point, right?
Yeah. And this is a good point, actually, because I think I had a long debate with referees about this point. And so in the traditional sense of the game, you're right that the cops move first. But in my definition of a game, which is fairly more general, first, initial conditions are given by nature, which means that they are placed randomly on some nodes of the graph. And then we need to have the robber move first to avoid the trivial situation where the cop just captures the robber in one move. I mean, we could do that, but then it would just mean you need to separate the solution into 2 different cases. So if we allow for the cop to move first, and we use my formulation where the initial conditions are given by nature, then for some possible initial condition, the cop would be able to capture the robber in one move, and that would not be the sense of what we're trying to do. So therefore, we assume that the robber moves first. Doesn't lead to any loss of generality.
So that's really interesting. What were the referees objecting to there?
So, well, the referee's objection was, as often is the case, was why do I depart from the traditional assumption that the cops move first? And I had to explain a little bit more why I'm doing that. And I had to give some examples to show that my formulation is more general than what's actually been assumed so far. And it has a very strong implication because if you read the Wachowski paper that was published sometime in 1983, in his paper, I think even in the introduction, he says clearly that if the cop doesn't win the game, then the robber wins the game. But in my work, actually, not in this paper, but in other works, related work, I've given an example where I can give you graphs where for some initial condition, the cops can win, and for other initial conditions, the robber can win. So you don't really have that kind of dichotomy between the robber winning and the cop winning.
What's interesting, of course, is there's not really, in a overarching sense, the idea that the robber can win. All the robber can do is continue to evade. And so, again, that idea that the game being finite means that the cop wins and it ends, or the game being infinite means that ostensibly the robber wins. But there's always, at some point, I guess, a potential of finiteness.
So I think infinity is an interesting concept in mathematics. If you think of infinity in its traditional sense, you need probably an infinite number of nodes to talk about infinity. However, in a graph, we can also talk about infinities if you just have a finite number of nodes through the concept of cycles. So cycles lead to infinity. And robber can win the game. So just think of a cycle 4. So just one cell in your chessboard, all right, with 4 nodes. So the robber wins that game. Robber winning is tantamount to saying that the robber can indefinitely escape. So there's no way that the cop can capture the robber, and that's true on that cell of the chessboard where you only have 4 nodes.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Then of course he moves indefinitely on that square, but I did not have to assume an infinite number of nodes. So we capture that idea of infinity from the cycle. You can go around a cycle an infinite number of times.
Yeah, we do that in linguistics with the concept of recursion.
Okay. Yeah, we've got recursion in mathematics as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you have embedding functions, for example, that can create a theoretically infinite but absolutely impossible to achieve set of combinations and things like that.
Yeah. So you can actually get infinity from finiteness, right? Through that recursion property.
Interesting. Yeah.
From listening to you, it feels like your intervention in economics comes very much from game theory. And of course, when I looked further into this, it was actually a field that was formulated by John Nash, of course, who was the legendary mathematician, in essence. So again, sort of things started to make sense as to why this is your kind of inroad and as to why this appeals to you so much. Is there something special about game theory that draws mathematicians and sort of more mathematically orientated economists towards it, do you think, as a field?
Again, very good question. And it is true, as a fact that I think most mathematicians who are actually working on economics these days have a background in game theory, and it seems like the natural channel. John Nash was famous, but there are many others who are not so famous, but who are mathematicians who became economists. I wouldn't think that there is a direct connection between the two. I would rather say it was accidental. Just this was the time when the RAND Corporation was investing a lot of money in the field of game theory because there was the belief that game theory can help win the war. Game theory can help coming up with war strategies. Especially pursuit-evasion game has been used in combat operation. Pursuit-evasion game has been used in developing missiles even, actually. So think of a moving target. So you can think of this game now being played between a missile trying to hit a moving target, but think of a target being an intelligence target. The target could also respond. So then several engineers have actually worked on this problem, and that was happening sometime even in the 1940s and the 1950s. And this was the reason why so many mathematicians were interested in game theory at that time. Well, there was John von Neumann, there was John Nash, and there was also Oscar Morgenstern from Princeton University, who were actually pushing for this. There are many natural applications of game theory in economics, because what is economics? Economics is all about decision. So, decisions from agents, really. And game theory is about strategic interaction between agents when they're making decisions. So there's a very natural room for applications of game theoretical solution in economics. And probably this is why game theory is so popular among economists.
I like that description of economics as a field, like it's about kind of making decisions.
Oh yeah, I think I say that to all my students from day one. I think at least there are two aspects of economics, but you can think of a major aspect of it as being decision making.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how you came to actually publish this paper? Because looking at your publication list and your outputs, you are pretty prolific, shall we say. So how did this paper specifically come about? How did you get interested in this and feel that you wanted to actually produce this one specifically?
Yeah, again, thank you for your comment. I mean, I still believe that I still have a lot more to do. I still have a lot of papers, a lot of ideas that I would like to get published. I mean, a publication itself, I would think, well, you start working on a research problem and then eventually it gets published, but sometimes it gets nowhere. So this was one topic, one research that was fortunate to probably being published eventually. But why did I push for it? Why was I very persistent in working on this area? It was precisely because I could generalize the notion of dismantlable graph. I could show to the community that we could do a lot more with dismantlable graph that was thought at the moment in the literature. There was a lot of opposition, and that's very common. I think if you're in academia, I mean, if you actually come up with ideas that are fairly novel, you will get opposition because I think most of the well-known academics are rather conservative and they don't want you to depart too much from the status quo. If you depart from the status quo, you will get objection, you will get opposition, you will get rejection. So this paper was rejected before from other journals. I mean, this is the journey of research. I think rejection is part of it, failure is part of it. And in fact, it was rejected in a journal that I'm myself an associate editor of, and I think it was fairly transparent, but sometimes you don't agree with the referees and you tend probably to agree to disagree on many things. But the reason really was that I was departing from traditional formulation of this game and the referees were not very happy with it. And all I had to do after was to rewrite the paper several times to probably make it look, I would say, something that is not departing too much from the literature, something that is more friendly to the existing literature. So I had to probably change the notation several times to use their own notation until finally the community is accepting it. I think the paper is published, at least in a serious journal, when the community somehow overall accepts your idea. I would say, and I think somebody told me that before, one of my old professors said, well, his best paper was the paper that he hated the most because he had to write it so many times that when it was actually published, he just didn't like the paper anymore.
This sounds hauntingly familiar. So it's not just this field for sure. Shravan, aside from the reviewers, has there been any reaction to the article? So have you heard back in terms of criticism or positive reinforcement? Has any conversation been started with this particular article?
Yeah, so I've presented, now I'm working on similar work, so I'm trying to generalize this concept for directed graphs and also for more general formulations like hypergraphs and so on. So I do present this work in several conferences and seminars, and there are reaction. I think people seem to accept the idea. People seem to be using it. I think I have colleagues who've used this paper in different contexts. Yeah, I think it's gaining acceptance even more slowly. So the negative reaction are less these days. I think after the paper is published, you get less negative reaction. And I'm hoping, it's just been recently published, so I'm just hoping for more impact, if I can use this word.
You mentioned that people are already using it. Can you give us any examples of that?
Yeah, so I've got a collaborator. So he's been working on differential games. So this is probably pursuit-evasion game on a different kind of structure. And he's used it recently in one of his paper with some of his PhD students. I've read the paper. He has not submitted it yet, of course, but I think he has used the main result of the paper to probably solve the problem he was trying to address.
And so what would you actually hope to achieve as regards problems that can be solved by this in the future?
As I said, there is a selfish aspect to it because one of my goals is to solve the manual conjecture, which is an open problem in mathematics. And I'm hoping to be able to use some of his ideas to actually get there. But again, this is fairly ambitious. Maybe I'll never get there in this lifetime. But I will still try.
Okay, so that gives us perfect segue into the next note. And you've touched on this a little bit, but where to now? What are your plans for the future here?
So as I said again from the beginning, there are three subfields in this work, and there are game theory, graph theory, and this solution concept of contraction, or what we call convergence. So I'm trying to actually bring the three fields together to try to think of a very nice intersection between the three, and then to come up with a generalized framework to solve a more general class of games. In terms of target, I'm hoping to continue to work on the Meniere conjecture. This is something that I've been working on for many years now, with some success, I would say. I mean, although nothing that's publishable, but I hope to get there.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you very much, Shravan. What are your plans immediately for the future? Do you have something coming out in the pipeline?
At the moment, I've got a paper under review on, again, this contraction-like property, but on a more general class of graphs that is called directed graph. And that is a
more
joint
graphs,
paper.
More graph theory.
It is on
You're
graph
really plugging
theory.
this.
That's right. But, but sometimes, I mean, the ideas are coming now and I don't want it to stop. So I think I'm just hoping that I can meet people in economics or other fields who are interested, and I would be happy to work on collaborative research.
Well, we have every confidence in your generalized framework and
Thank you.
collaborative research.
Yeah,
So-
utterly fascinating. I look forward to seeing what comes about. A new way to look at an old problem, if we can say.
Oh, yeah,
And,
it's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much for coming in to talk
Thank
to
you,
us.
Thank
Shravan.
you. Thank you.
With 110 academic staff from 22 countries and regions, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science is committed to delivering world-class teaching and research, with a growing focus on interdisciplinary projects. Our faculty includes the School of Economics, the School of Education and English, the School of International Communications, and the School of International Studies, as well as the Language Centre.
We are committed to internationally renowned and excellent research in a thriving transdisciplinary environment of outstanding individual and collective research. Our faculty is home to a number of groundbreaking projects, including but not limited to digital heritage, game cultures, the historical and contemporary Silk Roads, health economics, cognitive neuroscience of language, and gender studies.
The Faculty of Humanities and Social Science is also proud to host a high percentage of international staff who bring expertise to areas such as history, politics, journalism, media and film studies, education, English, micro and macroeconomics, and more, as well as a wealth of experience from international universities.
We strive to offer an education and student experience reflecting the most up-to-date knowledge and achieve this through the close integration of teaching and research. Our research-led teaching places cutting-edge knowledge at the center of our curriculum, while our academic staff actively engage our students in their ongoing research activities.